Okay, in this video we are going to interact with a Microsoft SQL Server database, and we're going to query that database and select some data from a table and put it on a worksheet in Excel. So to do that, let's open up your Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, and let's look at our database. So my databases are on this server that is named mark-pc/SQL Express, and the databases on that server are in this folder here, databases. And the one we're going to look at is this My Company database, which has some tables in it. Well, just one table. It has this people table in it. So we're going to look at this table called people in this database called My Company on this server. And within this table, there's some columns: an ID column, a name column, an age column, and a date column. And we can query this table and look at what data is in it. So we could do a select statement like this: select ID, name, age from people. And right now there's only one row in the table. The row has an ID of 6, a name of Tom, and an age of 45. And what we want to do is be able to select from this table within VBA in Excel, so that we can get this data, and in particular this row of data, into an Excel worksheet. And then later we'll see how we can also insert, update, and delete stuff, just like we do in SQL Server Management Studio. We can perform all these SQL statements. We can do the same thing in VBA. So let's get started. Let's go to our worksheet, or our workbook, and let's insert a worksheet called database. And now let's go to our VBA editor, and I'm going to insert a module that I'm going to call SQL database, or I'll just call it, I'll call it SQL database. And now we can start writing some code. So I'll put sub SQL database, and the first bit of code I want to write is actually a comment. I want to tell you a few things. When you're working with databases, we're going to use something called ActiveX data objects, and we need to be able to work with them and have them available to us. So we need to go to the references and include a library. So we need to go up here to tools, references, and we need to go down to Microsoft ActiveX. There it was. This Microsoft ActiveX data objects library. Whatever the latest version, the most recent version is, the highest number here, for like I have 6.1. So you want to click this Microsoft ActiveX Objects 6.1 library, and I'm going to click OK. And now I have access to something known as the ActiveX data objects. And ActiveX data objects is commonly known as ADO. So I'll put this code requires a reference to ADO, ActiveX data objects library. And your code won't work. The code that we're writing is not going to work unless you include this reference. And basically what ADO does, ADO lets you access or allows you to connect to any data source like SQL Server, Access, Microsoft Access, CSV files, etc. So this ADO stuff, whatever this is, ActiveX data objects, it allows us to connect to data sources. And how the framework works, just to show you, is that, let's say, just imagine this, you have a data source somewhere, like here's my data source, right? And it's going to connect that this ActiveX data objects is sort of over here on this other side, like away from your data source, there's this ADO object. And in between here is what's called an OLE DB provider. So you have your data source, you have your ADO object over here, in between you have an OLED provider, and now they all sort of can talk to each other. The provider is sort of the go-between between the ADO object and the data source. And what you're going to be doing is using some object here that's going to go through this provider, and the provider is going to go to the data source, get your data, and send it back to the provider and back to your ADO object. And so that's why this goes both ways. Like this is like a forward and backward arrow, because you can go from the object to the data source and tell the data source what you want, and then the data goes back to your object. So let's declare some variables now. Now that we know we're going to be working with these objects, let's declare some of these objects. The first thing we're going to declare is what's called a record set object. So I'm going to do dim rs as ADODB dot record set. Oops. And this is what's going to hold our data. And you'll see that in a second. The next thing I'm going to declare is a connection, dim cn, or I'll do SQL connection, cn SQL as ADODB dot connection. And this connection is going to be sort of what these arrows are here. It's going to be the link to the provider. It's sort of going to connect our object to our data source. So it's going to sort of have some properties that is going to tell the provider, where our data source is and things like that. Then I'm going to declare a dim. Well, actually, I'll do a string variable called SQL string as string. So this holds the SQL text. When I say this SQL text, what I'm referring to is, this is our SQL text. It's our SQL command. So now we can start writing some code. I'll go back up here. Let me just write option explicit. And first thing I want to do is do this, sheets database dot select. I want to be on the right sheet. Then I want to do cells dot clear content. So I want to clear the sheet. And now I want to set this connection. So I want to do something like this, set cn SQL equal to a new ADODB dot connection. This is like this instantiates the connection, and by instantiate I mean it takes a connection and puts it in this object variable. So now we have a connection in this cn SQL object. And what we can do now is open the connection by doing something like this, cn SQL.open, and then you write provider is equal to SQL OLEDB.1 and integrated security is equal to SSPI and initial catalog equal to my company, and the data source is equal to the data source is going to be equal to our server. So I'll finish this in a second, but I want to show you what these first couple parameters do. We're setting the connection. So basically what we're doing is we're telling our object, here's our ADO object, right? It's a connection object. We're telling it where our data source is and what kind of data source it is. So this first provider tells the object that it's going to be a SQL database. This SSPI integrated security, that tells the object that we don't need to use a username and password. We could use Windows security, so we're not going to have a username and password to access our database. This initial catalog, my company, is the name of your database. So here's my company here. That's the name of our database. And then the data source is the server that it's on. And the name of the server is this here. Let's see. Right here, server. Right here. Mark-PC. This is the name of the server. So that's our data source. And you can see, like, there's our server. There's our table. Or there's our database. Server database. We need to tell our ADO object the same stuff. So here's our table, my company, and here's our data source. And now we should have a connection that works. And let's just run this to see if we get any errors. So I'm just going to put my cursor in here and click run. I don't get any errors. Let me just make sure I did this. I'm going to put hi. I'm going to run this. I do get an error there, but sorry. I'm going to go under the impression that there's no errors. Setting up these connection strings are sometimes a little bit tricky because there's a lot of weird parameters, but mainly you want to just know what you're connecting to. So in this video we're going to connect to a SQL database. In other videos we'll connect to an Access database. So you want to be able to change the provider and know what to put in here. In this case, SQL OLEDB.1, and then the name of your table is our database is your initial catalog, and the server. So now what can we do? Now that we have our connection, we can write a SQL statement like SQL string is equal to, and then what is it going to be equal to? Well, our SQL string, we want it to return this data to the worksheet. So we want to take this SQL string. I'm just going to copy this and put it in here. So now my SQL string, my actual SQL code, is just the exact SQL statement I would use in SQL Server Management Studio, and here it is, right? So this set the SQL statement, and this line here opens connection to the database. And now what we want to do is we have our SQL statement here and we're going to use it, but we need something to contain the data when it comes back to us. And for that we're going to set this record set object. Remember I told you this is going to hold data. So we'll do set rs is going to be equal to a new ADODB dot record set, and then we could do this record set dot open, and what we're going to do here is pass in our SQL string. So this source is going to be the SQL statement, so we pass in the SQL string, and then the connection, the next parameter is the connection, is going to be our CN SQL from up here. So now we're dealing with a record set object which needs to know, okay, I'm going to hold some data. Where am I going to get the data from? I'm going to get it from a database using this connection, and I'm going to query that database with this SQL string. And then there's these other parameters here. I could put a comment. This cursor type and this lock type, and then there's this open or option parameter. And these, I'm going to real quickly take you to msdn.microsoft.com, and if you go on MSDN, it stands for Microsoft Developers Network. You can search for stuff, and in this case I searched for the record set open method. So what we're doing, rs.open, it gives us some information on what these parameters are, because no one memorizes this stuff. And what we want to see is that we already dealt with the source and the active connection, and if we look at those down here, it says that the source is a SQL statement or a stored procedure, so we know what that is. It's our SQL statement. And the active connection is a valid connection object, so we know what that is. The cursor type, lock type options, let's take a look at those. So basically, when you have this record set, you're going to need a cursor type that tells the object how you can maneuver over that record set. So if I double click this cursor type enum, there's 5 different types of cursor types, and I don't want to go off into the weeds here and get you confused or anything, but all this is like how are you going to maneuver over the record set. You can, by default, it's this AD open forward only, which says it uses a forward cursor only, and you can only scroll forward through records. Then there's like a dynamic cursor type, where if people make changes to the data, you'll see those changes. You could take a look at these. Go on MSDN if you're interested. But by default, you're going to use this AD open forward only. But that allows you only to scroll forward through the record set. And in our case, we want to be able to get a record set in memory and get some data and scroll forward and backward. So we're going to use this one down here, AD open static, which allows you to go forward and backward and go through your record set. So when I go into my code here, I'm going to do AD open static, and then there's a lock type here, and let's just go back to this website. And lock type, this specifies the type of lock that is placed on the records during editing. So when you get your data from the database, there's going to be some locking mechanism that takes place that says, like, can you update the records or not? And we're going to use AD lock optimistic, which it locks records only when you call the update method. So you can take a look at this parameter. I don't want to do a whole video on this parameter. It's not really too critical, because most times you're going to use AD open static or AD forward only, and we are going to use AD lock optimistic. And like I said here, for this cursor type, you're going to use the forward only if you only want to scroll forward through the record set, or if you want to scroll forward and back, use AD open static. So now we have a record set object here that is open. And what we can do now is we can do something like this. Active sheet dot range A2 dot value is equal to dot copy from dot cells row 2 column 1 dot copy from record set RS. So we can do something like this. Once we have this line of code written, our record set is going to be populated with the data, and it's going to go into this RS object. And then we can copy from that record set object onto our worksheet here, and we can put the data on the worksheet. So put data in record set on the worksheet. So now if we run this, in SQL, when I run this SQL statement, select ID, name, age from people, I get one row and it has ID, name, age, and 6, Tom, and 45. Those are my results. Now I sort of did the same thing in my Visual Basic code here. I set up a connection object, and I opened it and said it's going to go to a SQL database. It's not going to use a username and password. It's going to go to this database. It's going to go to this server. On this server, there's a database called My Company. It's going to use this SQL string, and then I declared a record set object and said, I want data to go into this record set object that is from this connection and uses this SQL string and has this cursor type and lock type, and then I want to put that data, I want to copy from that record set onto the worksheet. So let's go to our worksheet. Here's our sheet called database, and we should see some data that goes right there. So let's run this, move this over, and if I click run, sure enough, I get 6, Tom, and 45. So this data here came from this SQL Server database, My Company, and it came from this SQL statement, which we wrote in our SQL Management Studio, but we also wrote it here in VBA. We put it right here, and that's how you would get the data onto your sheet. Now, we can sort of do this a little differently. Add some error checking into this. What if we don't get any rows returned from our query statement? Like, what if I do select name, age from people, where name equals Mary? So now if I copy this and run this, I have a different SQL statement. I don't get any values returned. And let's handle that case so we could find out like if values are returned. So what we'll do is do this. If rs.eof, then I'm going to put a message box. So this EOF is like the end of file. So if I run this line rs.open, this line puts data in the record set. And I'm going to check now if it's at the end of the file already. And that would mean there's no data. Then I want to put a message box. The record set is empty. And just to show you what this means, rs.eof is equal to rs.eof. I'm going to show you what the value in this property EOF is. If it's not empty, else I'll put a message box. Number of records equals and rs.record count. So this property rs.record count, it tells you how many records are in this record set. And let's do one more thing. In our worksheet, we don't have any headers here, but in our database we do. We have this ID, name, age, right? So I want to have these column names that I see in the SQL Server Management Studio. I want to have these in Excel too. So we can do that as well. We can go here and we could do something like this. For each QF, which is going to stand for query field, in rs.fields next QF. And what we can do is do range A1 dot offset, and then I want to offset 0 rows, and I'll put a column offset variable that I'm going to declare in a second. Dot value is equal to rs dot or qf dot name. And I'll do call offset equal call offset plus 1. So what I want to do now is put the headers here. I want to have the headers, and that's what this loop is going to do. This loop puts headers on the worksheet, and I need to declare a column offset variable. So dim call offset as integer, and I'll do call offset is equal to 1, because the first column I want the header in is column 1. So what I can do is, I have this record set, right? It contains my data. It also contains the field names. And these fields here are the 3 fields here. ID is a field, name is a field, age is a field. Our record set contains those fields and the data in those fields and the name of those fields. So what I do is loop over all the fields. I do for each QF, for each query field in the record set fields, put the query field name into the worksheet here. And where do I put it in the worksheet? I put it in range A1 dot offset 0 rows, and I want to offset the number of columns each time through the loop. And after I put the headers on the worksheet, then I'll put the data on the worksheet. So now if I run this, I should see headers in these columns up here. I'll put my cursor there, I'll click run. Oh yeah. So I have to declare this query field, and I'll just do dim qf as object. So remember, object is just a generic object. Oh, I gotta put an end if, sorry. So I have a generic object here, and I'm just gonna, you know, with that object, I'm gonna use the name property of that object. But in reality, it's not going to be a generic object. It's going to be whatever type object this field, the record set, each row in the record set is. So I can click run now, and it says the record set is empty. Record set is empty. rs.eof equals to true. Well, why is it doing that? It's doing that because our query didn't return anything. Because we said select everything from people where the name is Mary, but we don't have anything named Mary in our database or in our table. We have something the only name we have in our table is Tom. So now if I change that query to Tom and I run this, now it's going to get down here and the record set is not going to be empty. It's going to be true, and then it'll give me this. It'll do this stuff here. It will give me a message box that says what the number of records are. It'll put the headers on the worksheet, and then it'll put the data on the worksheet. So if I run this now, it says the number of records is 1, and then it did this. It gave me my headers. I have to fix this. It didn't put it in the right column, but it did. It did the right thing. It gave me my headers and it gave me my data. And let me fix that column issue here. So it put them in column 2. So if I go back here, first time through the loop, yeah, this should be 0. Because I'm in, so it put it in, it started in column B because what I'm doing is offsetting from range A1. And the first time through the loop, I don't want to offset one column. I want to offset 0 columns. So this should be 0. And now if I run it, it gives me exactly what I want. My headers and then the data from my table. So that's all I wanted to show in this video, how you can connect to a SQL Server database and set up a connection, set up a record set, check if the record set is blank, and if it's not, you can do something. You can put the records on the worksheet. You can put the headers on the worksheet. One last thing we need to do is just set this RS. We need to close our record set, and we need to set our record set equal to nothing. And this is just good programming practice. You don't want to leave your record sets open, and you want to set them back to nothing so that they're eliminated from your memory, so that your memory on your computer is not like full of queries or data from your queries that's held in these record set objects. So we'll carry on with this in the next few videos, and we'll show you how to do some of these other SQL statements like inserting, updating, and deleting, and then we'll show you how to do a stored procedure, and then we'll do the same sort of thing in Microsoft Access. So you'll be able to query data not only from SQL Server but query it in Access as well. All right, thanks.